appreciating what you've said about we're in early days. Um, as currently drafted, what are the anticipated new documentation requirements under the Act? You mentioned more.
Right. So there's a great adage, which I've always liked, which is
Yeah.
what gets reported, gets noticed, gets done. And one of the ways that in management science you drive compliance through an organization is you put in place management reporting, and then management or reporting, and then that reporting eventually makes its way through the management cycle, and you tend to ensure compliance through that process.
Yeah.
So where traditionally the obligation was to have policies and practices to give effect to the compliance with the legislation, it wasn't particularly prescriptive. Now, as we've moved away from the old model, which was um, complicated to deal with, and a lot of it was sort of implied through large general statements, the new legislation is much more laid out, has much clearer statements. What are the things you're thinking about? You'll need to have documentation in prescribed form that will address how you are obtaining consent, the purposes for how you're using information. In some instances, privacy impact assessments are now required before you implement. So, driving you to have to generate reports so that you are being forced to think about the issues as you're in the process of looking at your data, the tools, and the outcomes. What's particularly interesting is the ability of the commissioner to request those materials so they can audit them. So, in the absence of an investigation, so a complaint or a knowledge, there's an enforcement capability of asking, please provide me all of these materials so I can then review whether or not you are appropriately documenting what you're doing. And this is speculation on my part, but I think that's being driven by my favorite adage: what gets reported, gets noticed, gets done. And the government's sort of saying, hey, if I make you go through a process of documenting or reporting, and you know that I can ask for it, then you're more likely to put that documentation in place. And if you have to put that documentation in place, then you're more likely to have thought about the issues and done this in a compliant way. And I get to what I want, which is a more privacy um, uh, compliant world, a more safe and functioning space where the rules are known and understood, but I don't have to wait until enforcement, right? I'm putting the incentive earlier on to be compliant instead of waiting for me to catch somebody who is doing bad work and everyone will then, suddenly learn because of that problem. I'm hoping that I'm driving it much earlier into the process. And I actually think that although it seems like it's a burden to the organization, I actually think that is less cost and less risk to the organization because now they have better guidance on what they need to do. They'll have better understanding of what good documentation looks like. And more importantly, they will be driving themselves into the investments at the very beginning when it's less expensive to develop a privacy compliant process than having to retrofit 5 years later with all sorts of liability because they haven't been compliant along the way.
Mhm.
So it's a bit of a long answer, but it's more paper, and there's going to be a lot of grumbling about
Yes.
paper and more process. And
Yes.
it's a cottage industry for the consultants, and you could even say the lawyers. We're, but I think what it does as well, if we go back to my very first comment, it's a real opportunity being given to the organizations to say, go back and have a look at your privacy, but while you're at it, have a look at everything you're doing with data, the tools, and the outcomes, and see if you can't get a productivity lift at the same time.
Mhm. You referenced, Stephen, that privacy legislation globally is are versions of consent-based models, and the concept of consent. Does that differ in any material way under this proposed legislation than it did under PIPEDA in
So,
meeting that standard?
it's becoming a lot clearer where the standard of what was consent. If we stand back for a moment, the standard, we're remembering that the federal legislation doesn't sit in a vacuum. It sits within the context of Alberta, BC, Quebec, and then for the clients that cross borders, all the other jurisdictions in the world where they go. So an organization is typically dealing with 4, 5, 10 pieces of privacy legislation. And when you're dealing with that many pieces of legislation, you're driving yourself to the comply with the most strict requirement, right? If you comply with the most strict, then you've complied with all of them.
Mhm.
So good consent has been driven on understanding of one, what the test is, and typically, and I'll use the Alberta wording, it's what a reasonable person would consider as reasonable in the circumstances. So it's an objective test as at the time about that particular activity. So that is a pretty, but that's a pretty interesting standard. But we see all the research going on around what does this generation think is privacy versus this generation thinks is privacy. And so that standard varies a great deal in the context of what would a 18-year-old versus a 65-year-old consider to be an invasion of privacy.
Yeah.
It's
Mhm.
contextual. The
Yes.
second thing you have is there's lots of guidance from the commissioners around meaningful consent, around full knowledge and consent. There's lots of sort of terminology out there. The standard that's coming out under the proposed legislation is much clearer and brings it all together into a single place. So I think that is a big win for everyone because it's taking rumblings and decisions and varying things and saying, well, here's a better, more strict here's a better standard that's clearer to understand, but it's still at the end of the day is, it's for a reasonable purpose or legitimate purpose. You have to understand either it's implied, it's reasonable to expect that would have happened, or it's being expressed. You've explained what's going on, and they've had some action to show that they agree what's going on. I think at the end of the day, for most organizations, we probably are already there most of the time in meeting the standard, but I don't think we are as well documented on it. And I don't think we've taken the steps to make sure that as the information's come in, it hasn't bled into other uses which are not covered in the consent. So I think it'll drive some cleanup is to those additional uses which have been added on over time, but they haven't
Mhm.
clean up their consent process. What I do think is interesting in the consent world is the new legitimate interest carve out, where we don't know a lot about it because the regs aren't available yet. But there's this idea that you can use information for a legitimate purpose without consent, as long as you've met the requirements. And the way I read that is, I think this is going to drive us into enabling the artificial intelligence tools to be taught, and that if you de-identify, anonymize this legitimate interest process, where I don't need to go back to the whole pool of individuals to say, can I use all of this data to teach my model? What I
Mhm.
instead have to do is meet these very strict requirements, possibly have to do a privacy impact assessment, and then I can use it to teach my models so I can accelerate my use of AI using a better data set. So
Mm.
that I think is new in the consent world of having what I believe and hope will be a clear mechanism to support Canada developing its AI productivity.
And you mentioned that we don't know yet what is meant by appropriate and legitimate. Um,
Well,
s-
that cottage industry
whether it's the
comment, yeah,
furtherance of the corporation's business interests, for example. Right?
right,
Yeah.
right. It's that cottage industry for lawyers. There
Yeah.
are a number of places in this legislation where we're using new terminology. It's not necessarily defined terminology.
Mhm.
And so we'll need the legislation to get through the process, second reading, committee, third reading.
Mhm.
We'll need to see the regulations, and then we'll need to see the guidance from the commission and the commissioner around how do we then apply that. So I think there's
Yeah.
lots of opportunity for us to get more comfortable with what those words mean, and then ultimately the lawyers will fight about it,
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
right, and get better guidance through that process.
Mhm.
Uh, but what I if I just take myself from the ground and go back up to 50,000 feet, I see this as Canada positioning itself to say, we are because we have strong privacy controls, because we have strong privacy enforcement, we have clear audit and documentation. It's reasonable for us to permit certain data sets to be used to help accelerate our AI economy. And we're finding the right blend between uh, privacy and productivity.
Mhm.
Right, and so I'm very excited by that because it
Yeah.
it it shows a couple of things, and I'm uh, these are speculative comments, and they're the opinions of myself, but I think it suggests that there's some really strong, deep thinking has gone into how do we, handle all of these competing interests and get to where we as Canadians want to get to, which is
Yeah.
we want a better standard of living with better services, better goods, better delivery, but we want it secure, and I want to feel comfortable that I'm not going to be abused in the process. And I keep
Mhm.
finding that blend through the legislation, and we'll know more as we go.
Okay. So that's very helpful. Um, the legislation also speaks about um, disposal, getting rid of your data. So are there new or additional rights regarding how long you keep and how you can get rid of everyone's personal information?
So it's much clearer. And
Okay.
I think it's actually, I'm going to segue for a second here and go. I did mention about, the federal legislation sits and it has to work with the provincial, but it also has to work with all of the other jurisdictions with
Mhm.
which we operate. And one of those really big jurisdictions across the Atlantic Ocean is the European Union.
Yeah.
And Canada has worked very hard to make sure that our privacy legislation is found to be adequate. It's a terrible word, but adequate under the rules and GDP. And our federal legislation was inadequate. So that's really good because it means that information can flow back and forth between Canada without having to follow the more complex um, uh, safeguard rules. Some of the edits in our legislation are, I think, to align us more to where GDPR has gone, right? It's been 20 something years since I'm not going to admit how many because I was there when we wrote some of this legislation and I'm refusing to admit my age today. You can probably edit that out, but let's go with it anyway. The,
Mhm.
the, some of these rights and some of the approaches are being driven to ensure we maintain our adequacy wording, and so rights of some of the rights, you need to think in the context of why would Canada add that? But a part of it is we want to make sure on a global basis we stay current so that we maintain our economy and our ties with our trading partners and we don't create a barrier to the flow of information because we want to ensure that we are on the uh, that makes it as easy as possible for us to participate in that in those economies. For the data mobility rights, I think it's important to note that what it actually says and mean in the draft legislation. So Section 72 of the draft provides that subject to the regulations not yet released, on the request of an individual, their organization must uh, uh, disclose the personal information that is collected from the individual to an organization designated by the individual if both organizations are subject to a data mobility framework. And I think what I've been reading so far in the commentary is that people are missing that it has to sit within a framework. So it's not that I have the right to say my personal information has to be extracted and then handed over by you to anyone.
Mhm.
It's if there are 2 financial institutions in the same, network or 2, um, uh, text providers within or within a telecommunications network, that the ask to say, "Please transfer my data set from you to you so that I still can maintain access to it," is being driven so that we limit the competitive advantage of stickiness of data by letting the data move freely. So one of the problems is you sign up with a service provider, you get a big package of historical data and it keeps growing. And as an individual, it is too cumbersome and painful to move that information from one provider to another provider so you
Yeah.
maintain your history to access it. So
Yes.
what I can see happening is, and this is very protective, is to make sure there's fair competition within a framework to be established in the regulations.
Mhm.
Data will move so that I'm not stuck with one organization, because to leave them and go to somebody else, I would lose the access to all of my historical information. And so when you think about that in context, data mobility within the data mobility framework, and proof will be in the pudding as we see the legislation evolve and the regulations come out, I think is really a pro competition provision
Mhm.
to enable individuals to be agnostic as to provider, because, or at least data repository agnostic as to provider, so that they are able to pick the best deal for them and we get a better deal for Canadians. We're not beholden to a particular service provider which has a large and bulky set of personal data that I can't otherwise extract and move. I hope you guys can edit that down
Oh,
to
we
something,
can't.
but
Oh, no, that's no problem. I had a follow-up question, which is, and if I'm the organization, um, what do I have to do to make sure that I'm on side Canada's proposed data mobility, and
so
portability?
what I think you're going to see is the frameworks
Yeah.
will create the mechanisms to enable the fair and free movement of that information. So you'll have, let's say, um, you've got 5 organizations that form this framework, and they have to allow this consumer information to go from one repository to the next repository.
Mhm.
That's really complex to do on a one off.
Yes.
But if you've established a set of rules between all 5 of you to get to a common handoff protocol, so the data comes in a certain package at a certain time, and this is what you can rely on for the data. And so when you receive the package of data, you can then bring it into your system in the same way, that so you can, because you need to reflect the data. The whole point is you can't lose the data. Is that mobility will get sorted by the framework members, taking into context what each of their systems in fact needs, and they'll be able to iron out the unnecessary costs and complexities to get to a simple commonality about how they'll do those handoffs, right? Can that But that's going to require a framework to be established within the industry players, who then will have to get together and create it. So while I appreciate where the government is going, and I see from a consumer protection and a privacy protection methodology, you should do it. And a too big to fail. Like if one of them was to go bankrupt or have an insolvency and you wanted to get your data out, uh,
Mm.
these are significant pro consumer concerns, and I think the framework methodology, I'm hoping, will address the organization's concerns about, I'm not developing 5 different ways of handing off to 5 different members in the same organization or the same framework. I want to have one methodology that I'm going to agree to both send it out and receive it. So I only have to build one set of integrations, not 5. Right. And I think that's where there's going to be a lot of complexity and work.
And hopefully the frameworks are inclusive as opposed to exclusive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
and then, so that's one of those areas where it's the provision is, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 7 lines long
uh,
in the legislation. Like, it literally is this tiny little provision,
yeah.
but it's a good example where if you understand what is trying to be achieved in the legislation, and then you can understand sort of the whys and the whats, you can then look at the hows and begin to realize that is not a straightforward thing to do.
No.
And it is not going to be rolled out to every single organization. It's going to be rolled out to, and that's why I wanted to get the legislation right, to organizations that are subject to a data mobility framework. So the government's going to pick and choose which organizations and clusters are going to be in these data mobility frameworks. And I think we'll see they will be in the organizations which are larger
Yes.
and which have more of a of a potential for uh, where we want to foster as much competition as possible.
Yes.
He
Yes.
says, trying to be very careful how I say that.
Yes.
I get comes from my these are my views, not those of my firm
Yeah,
or any particular.
because what we don't want is a what seemingly a pro-competition bill to not reach those objectives.
Right. And
Yeah.
I think so, and I think that's one area where there'll be lots of commentary.
Mhm.
And frankly, I think you may see some voluntary codes being developed, right? Like if this is the issue and the government wants to go there, then oftentimes you'll see Canadians say, "Okay, that's a good point," and we'll start trying to get ahead of it already,
Mhm.
and start seeing voluntary codes and processes and working groups underway. I'm hoping that now that we have the draft and we can see where the government thinks it wants to go, some of that work will get underway so that we can truly understand what the cost of this would be. And then that can be weighed for the cost and the benefit, right?
Yes. Um, similarly, Stephen, you've spoken a lot about how the objective of this act is to enable Canada's use of artificial intelligence and machine learning and the predictive analytics that are going to, um, once we get past all our growing pains, is meant to make our lives better and more affordable. Um, does the bill get into requirements on an organization that's using AI, automated decision making tools?
It does. And so if we sort of step back and think about there's kind of two sides to this question about artificial intelligence in the context of privacy. One is how do I collect the data I need so that I can build the model and the tool that I need? We need to have a big pool of data so that we can get to a right predictive artificial intelligence enabled tool.
Mhm.
That covers the de-identified, the anonymized, the legitimate interest, and some of the other provisions, which are designed to enable good tools to get built. The second thing that we're looking for, though, is but I don't know what the AI is doing, and I should know what the AI is doing. So the automated decision making wording has come in. Now, Quebec already has introduced automated decision making wording into their legislation
Yes.
and beginning to have some experience with it. What's interesting is actually the difference between the two. Quebec's legislation provides that um, uh, an enterprise that uses personal information to render a decision based exclusively on automated processing of that information needs to inform the person concerned no later than at the time it informs the person of the decision about the personal information being used. Um, uh, sorry, that they use the tool, and then if they're asked, what was the personal information used, the reasons, the principal factors and parameters that led to the decision, and the right of the individual to have any information that may have been used to render that decision corrected. So they have a process which applies to all decisions, and it's you need to tell me that you used a tool if it's exclusive, and then I have the right to ask to know more about what happened. So if there's an error in the information about that decision, I can have it corrected.
Okay.
And I'm being very generic as I describe it, complex thing. Um,
Mhm.
the under the the federal draft legislation, you need to provide a general account of the use of automated decision systems that make predictions, recommendations, or decisions about individuals. So that's a much bigger pool.
Mhm.
And but it's a smaller pool because it's not just the decision or the recommendation or prediction. It would that would have a legal or similar effect on them. And we don't know what that means yet.
Yeah.
And upon request, provide the information with an explanation of the prediction, recommendation, or decision that has used the automated decision process, so they can, interact and have a discussion about what they should do to fix it.
Upon
So
request.
upon request. So what this really drives
Mhm.
is you're going to need to understand your data, your tools, and your outcomes to understand where your AI is being implemented, in your business processes, and then to look at and say if this prediction, recommendation, or decision could have a legal or similar significant effect on the individual, then I'm going to have a higher level of transparency,
Mhm.
have to provide information. Where the Quebec was, if a decision is made exclusively on the tool, then you have to advise them. So they have to tell everyone every time it's used exclusively. We have to tell you when it's used, not necessarily exclusively, but it has to have an impact. So it's one where the two Venn diagrams don't line up. Uh,
Mhm.
and as a result, I think there will be lots of discussion to come around what this means. Back to my very first comment about
Mhm.
the opportunity. We know that artificial intelligence is having and driving productivity gains. We know that people are looking at their data and their tools and their outcomes seriously. Privacy is going to drive us to understand where the tools are being used and how they're impacting with the data. Let's use that opportunity for compliance to also consider how best to drive productivity gains, how best to improve our businesses, how best to document and put in place the management controls we need to make sure that those decisions are useful and are being used correctly. I think of it as an opportunity to do those deep dives, because I think we'll get a better net result because we know productivity gains can be made. We just have to do the work to be able to get there. And this gives us the incentive and the reason to go do that work.
So, on the work portion, Stephen, stepping back from this, based on how the bill currently reads, and understanding that we've got a lot of open questions and issues of interpretation where reasonable people can and will disagree,
Yep.
right? 'Cause that's part of the process. What what do you think is going to be the biggest implementation challenges for at least financial services firms that are going to be subject to this bill?
So if we step back 20 years ago, our world was had a lot of pieces of software running on hardware that was owned and run by the organization. And
Mhm.
so they had their own hardware, they had their own server rooms, they had software running on it, and it was sort of a enclosed system. Step forward, we went through the outsourcing phase. Take my computers and my software and run it for me. You're better at running it for me.
Mhm.
Okay. We took the first step to move away from on premise to maybe a data center, and somebody else is actively managing it for me. So I reduced my body count in the organization that understood what my data was, what my tools were, what my hardware was, and how it was getting used. Right. I outsourced it. Then we went, well, outsourcing is expensive and the refresh rates are expensive. I don't know what they're doing from a capital point of view. And are my computers old enough or not? And I don't like what I'm doing. So I'm going to just get rid of all of this and go to software as a service. And I'm just going to rent space in somebody else's mess of organized. And all I care about is not all this hardware and software and management. All I'm going to do is, again, reduce my body count and just connect to somebody else's system to process my data for me. And I don't necessarily need to understand as much about how they're doing it. What I know is here's my data, here's the outcome I want, and they'll get me to that outcome. So we go to a SaaS model and a cloud model.
Mhm.
Well, the problem is, as you went from one system to a managed system to cloud and SaaS models, now I've got 15, 20, 100 different SaaS models running. And the whole point about a SaaS model is, or a cloud model is, they keep the system current. They're securing it, they're running it, they're keeping it current. They're continually evolving and patching and doing all the things they need to do to make that ecosystem of activity stay current. Which means, and I have very little visibility into what they're doing. if you think about the automated decision process, where a prediction, a decision, or a recommendation is made about an individual as information is processing through a SaaS, the biggest problem for the organizations is I don't actually know where all my data is or what's happening to it. And I don't know what tools are being used at any point in time on it. Even if I do an audit today, that
Mhm.
SaaS model will evolve tomorrow and Wednesday and the next Wednesday and the Friday after that and. So I now have to stay current on understanding all the SaaS models. So the very thing I did, which is get rid of all of that so I could just focus on the process and not focus on the how, because that's where I was. I have to go back to understanding that so that I can drive my compliance.
Mhm.
It's one of the problems of, in many ways, we've outsourced so much. We are now our business evolution is being done to us by our vendors, not
Mhm.
by us or with us. And when you think about the privacy world, this is an obligation that sits upon us, and we have to do this. And so I think it's a real opportunity for our business folks and IT folks to better understand the data, the tools, and the outcomes, and make sure that they have clear line of sight and governance in what they're doing so that they can have competitive advantage by doing it better. If we're all using the same tool, then we're not using that tool for competitive advantage. We're using it for competitive stability.
Yes.
If we move ourselves to understanding our data, our tools, and our outcomes, then we're able to think about how do I best manage that from compliance, but also how do I now drive a productivity gain so I can improve my competitive position, do better in the market, get a better return to my shareholders, and all of those things. So I think there's a real element, and I know you asked about financial services, and I'm going to sort of just that was more of an organizational chat, but I think
Yeah,
the same
it
concept applies.
applies to them, yes.
And I don't want to get, so I'm going to keep it more of an organizational level than a financial. But I actually think we're in a very tough position where many of our IT organizations are so thin because we've outsourced so much that we don't actually understand what our data and tool ecosystems look like and how we're going to meet this requirement. Because you have 30 days to comply. And if
Mhm.
you don't comply in your 30 days, they can make their complaint. And if you process through and you get to a decision that you haven't met the complaint, I have a private right of action,
Mhm.
right? And so the other piece to this is a lot of outsourcing. Canada's only we're a huge geography and we're very rich in all of our resources and we're very thankful for those. But we're like 40 million people, plus or minus. I'm not gonna get that exactly right. But
Mhm.
of our 40 million people, we're quite a small set of individuals, which means we are routinely taking expert systems across borders. And the other portion of what does this drive, which I think people need to pay very close attention to, are the requirements to be able to explain and to consider the privacy impacts to the individuals if you go to a service provider outside of Canada.
Mhm.
That is a material upgrade in thinking at the federal level, and it frankly brings the federal legislation more in line with the Alberta legislation, which has had it for years. That if information leaves Canada, then you need to be able to tell people what jurisdiction it went to. Um, how many of those SaaS providers say, I have the right to process anywhere in the world? And we won't be able to accept that as a construct in as a Canadian processing personal information using one of those SaaS tools, because you're going to have to tell individuals what the privacy implications are for each of the jurisdictions where that data may be processed. And the idea of having to provide 180 odd country, whatever the number is, possibilities, that is a daunting task for anyone in IT or operations or legal.
Mhm.
So there's I think there's a recognition that our dismal productivity gains in Canada for the last decade can in fact begin to be turned around if we help people pay attention to what are they doing with this vital business asset. And maybe we should be looking at really once again understanding what it is, like we did 20 years ago, and how it is being used and where it's being used and what it's being exposed to. That is a very long answer, and I'm sorry for that, Laura.
Oh,
But
no.
yeah, I wanted to explain that
Great
because
answer. Yeah.
the privacy legislation, a lot of lawyers can just walk you through this is a change. What I'm trying to make sure I do for you is deliver the so what to the business.
Yes. Yes.
Right? And so it's a little odd for a lawyer to go and explain that sort of productivity element. But I think that's what's driving the legislation. And I think it's important to think about what's the federal government trying to drive us to? What are their levers and pulleys and levers they can use? And sometimes it's compliance. So this change in documentation, this artificial intelligence, you have to be transparent if it making a recommendation or a prediction, if it's of significance, right? Whatever that legal or similar significant effect wording ultimately ends up being, there is some level of impact materiality there. But what is really driving me to do, I think about that, adding in that world, if it leaves the Canadian border, I need to know where and how, is really forcing me to think about my data and think about how I'm using it and making sure I'm doing it in a way that is compliant. But at the same time, if I'm doing that, going back to my very first comment, good
Mhm.
God, think about how to use it better and drive a competitive advantage. If you're already under the hood, check everything,
Yes. Mhm.
right? And I'll get mocked by my friends for the car analogy, much like I'll get mocked for my Calgary Stampede T-shirt. It was our or shirt today. It is Calgary Stampede, and all of Calgary switches to Western wear. And I had to get that in there, Laura, because
Yeah,
in eight to
Stephen.
10 weeks, I'm going to see this going. What is he wearing?
No, 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 no. This has been immensely helpful. Thank you so very much for joining us today. This has provided much needed context. Thank you.
No, thank you for the opportunity. And no, there's a lot to pay attention here as it develops. And what I'm really hoping is that organizations use it as the opportunity it is. Yes, there's more risk, but if I stand back, we have a pretty good track record in Canada of being respectful of people's privacy and following the rules. We're a good, safe economy for doing that. What we're doing is creating an opportunity to better compete in the world. And I'm hopeful that this is not cast as a compliance cost, but in fact is looked at as an opportunity to make Canada better.
We are hopeful with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.